Thank you very much for accepting the invitation to come and share Jesus in the area here. We have our church. Wondering, Pastor David, if you wouldn't mind just sharing a little background, please, your background.
Oh, okay. I'm actually a mechanical tradesman. I started off working on jets in the Air Force and then worked on trucks and later on cars and now people. And I approach my work today the same as I approached my trade, with excitement, always a sense of trepidation whether the thing's going to start. But yeah, so basically I guess I'm a motor mechanic, but now I'm a religious mechanic.
Fantastic. David, you've been in ministry for a number of years now.
Nearly 40.
Nearly 40 years? Wow.
Only paid for 34 of them, I think.
40 is terrible.
And you're also a pilot?
Yes, I like to fly.
Wonderful.
I think we've been up in the same plane, haven't we?
We have indeed. And I felt very safe. Pastor David, the Lord has blessed you indeed with a number of gifts, and thank you that tonight and for the next 8 nights following, you'll be sharing one of those gifts with us, the gift of sharing Jesus through evangelism. And so, God bless you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. As you saw on our flyer, which was up on the screen before, this is only one of 9 programs, so it's a fairly short series as far as evangelistic series is concerned. And so we're really just hitting the highlights. Some of these series in the old days used to go for a whole year. We're only going for 9 nights. So to pick 9 programs out of say 48 is no mean feat. So what we're really looking at is an overview, if you like, of Bible prophecy in our day. Now, when we do finish tonight, there is just a 1-sheet resume that I've made up, which just hits the highlights of what we've done tonight. And there is also a little program that shows you what programs are coming up. Like, for example, tonight is The Last Empire. What is The Last Empire? Tomorrow night will be The Signs of the End of the World. In Christian terms, we like to think of that as signs of the second coming of Jesus Christ, which are synonymous. And so as we commence tonight's program, we'll just roll through a video.
Pastor David, I notice there's a number of these at the back.
Oh yes, there is. If you've got some friends that perhaps didn't get one of them, then there are a few left up the back. Now, as usual, every time on opening night, there always seems to be gremlins, and Royce and I spent about a couple of hours today here going through and rehearsing everything, and it was fine, mate, wasn't it? What happens when the real thing comes along?
Questions will be answered, mind stimulated, vision for the future made clearer. Yet more than ever, we will discover real hope for the future. Exciting events that are about to usher into existence. The Last Empire. Discover real hope for the future.
So tonight's program is entitled The Last Empire. And the reason you'll see shortly why it's entitled The Last Empire was way back in the year 1927. The USS S4 was sailing in Boston Harbour near the town of Plymouth, Province Town, up in Plymouth, up on Cape Cod, and it was rammed by one of its own destroyers. When you read the story, it's really a case of people not following the rules again. The rules were written about submarine operations in Boston Harbour and destroyer operations, but They'd been not really followed for a lot of years, so everybody thought that they didn't matter anymore. And consequently, that's what happened. There were 39 souls on board. 6 sailors survived the initial collision. And when Navy divers went down, they were able to communicate via Morse code, knocking on the hull. And the sailors, the 6 surviving sailors inside, asked a simple question. They just said, "Is there any hope?" And of course, that is the question that we're asking in this troubled world, especially in the war-torn areas of today. And during the next 9 meetings, really all I want you to understand is that there is hope for our world. Probably not the sort of hope that you're thinking about. In other words, will the United Nations fix everything up? Doesn't seem to have happened in the past so far. And certainly not happening in our world today, is it? Seems that not many people are listening. And so, what does the future hold? It's a future not from the astrology section of the newspapers I used to read back in the day. We don't get the future, of course, from the local clairvoyant or the fortune teller or the card reader or the tarot card reader. I'm talking about the kind of future that really, for the purposes of these meetings, has 2,600 years of valid, established history. Now, most of us have been alive for at least 10 years, and we can remember that far back. Some of us can remember a few years longer than that. And we know history has a bad habit of being truthful and valid. And so when we look at the 2,600 year of history that we're going to review tonight, you can be assured that it's all been validated, it's truthful, and it can't be changed. It's interesting that throughout history, various empires have dominated or tried to dominate large portions of our planet, dating right back to the days of Egypt, ancient Mesopotamia, where we had Medes, Persians, we had Assyrians, and then back down through the ages, it went up to Rome, of course, and then during the 18th and 19th centuries, there was a proverb, the sun never sets on the British Empire. And of course, that was probably true up until, well, I'm not sure, maybe up till World War II, maybe. But of course, today, the country that dominates the world is the US of A, isn't it? It dominates the world economically, politically, militarily, and probably culturally. There's not many places in the world where I've been, Pastor Jake, and probably you too, where there's not a McDonald's. There are. Now, in some countries, that's a blessing. In other countries, it's probably not so much of a blessing. But if you're stuck in one of these third world countries and there's a McDonald's there, at least you know you can get some fries to eat. So, in superpowers, as far as superpowers is concerned, what we're going to look at tonight is what the old book talks about as the world's last empire. And if we have understood Bible prophecy correctly, the last empire is not too far away. Why do I say that? I'm not a sensationalist. I don't like speculation. I tend to have a scientific mind that's based on my engineering background. So I like to, add the ones and ones up. And in my research over the past 40 odd years now, I haven't changed my mind. Matter of fact, the more I read, the more I see world conditions, and as time passes, the more I'm convinced that the world's last empire will certainly appear. So, is there any real hope for the future? I certainly hope that after tonight you'll see that God is in control and that there is hope. What I'd like us to do now is look at where we are in human history, and is there any hope? Now, our Bible contains over 6,000 years of human civilization, And every time it has predicted future events about any of the great civilizations that have existed in the past, it has been 100% accurate. Now that's a photo of the Geneva Human Rights and Alliance of Civilizations meeting complex. This is where all the countries of the civilized world come together and meet and discuss things. And in, I think it was about halfway through this year, this was their agenda. It says, the 53rd session of the United Nations Human Rights Council from 19 June to 14 July, so this is past, will consider issues including sexual orientation and gender identity, violence and discrimination against women and girls, poverty, peaceful assembly and association, and freedom of expression, among others. It will also present an opportunity to address grave human rights situations, including Afghanistan, Belarus, we could say Ukraine, China, Eritrea, Israel, and the occupied Palestinian territories, which is in the news at the moment, Russia, Sudan, Syria, Venezuela, among many others. Matter of fact, you may not know this, but at this present time, today, there are 32 different wars occurring in our planet. They all don't get the front page, obviously, but it's a real mess. And when we look at what's happened in the world, the things that aren't reported, for example, from 1949 right up to about 1985, 80 million people died of starvation in China. 80 million. That's amazing, isn't it? All because somebody decided to kill all the birds who couldn't eat the insects, so the insects ate all the grain. From 1917 right up to Mr. Khrushchev coming into power, there were something like 60 million people went missing in Russia from Marxism. We don't really hear about those sorts of things that happen in the world today, that have happened in the world. And so the Bible foretells the future is, what the future is, but it's not all doom and gloom. There's a passage that the Apostle Paul wrote many years ago, and it's been one of my favorite passages. He said this, he said, "Eye has not seen, nor has ear heard, nor have entered into the heart of man the things that God has prepared for those who love him." I became a Christian after being in the occult and spiritualism for 17 years. I was raised a Christian in a huge denomination, joined the military at 17, came under Eastern religions and practiced that for about 17 years. And the world that I always hoped existed, I never ever found there. But when I became a Christian and started reading the Bible, that was the world I found. And it's a world that I know is true because it's backed up by so many years of history. Eye has not seen, nor has ear heard, nor have entered into the heart of man the things that God has prepared for those who love him. Sometimes I pinch myself and say, is this real? And then I've got to go back to my training and say, yes, it is real. And so I promise you that if you see this whole series through, the world of your fondest dreams and your unimaginable future is within your grasp, and it all starts tonight. I want you to have hope that your decisions from this night forward will be positive and life-changing. And so I'd like to begin this series of meetings with a story from times long ago and see why our times are like they are in the light of Bible prophecy. I want to take you back about 2,500 odd years to ancient Mesopotamia, to the city of Babylon. In 605 BC, in the ancient city of Babylon, a powerful warrior prince by the name of Prince Nebuchadnezzar was besieging the city of Jerusalem over there in Israel. He was the son of King Nabopolassar, who was really a scientist. The Babylonians, especially on his class, were from a class of academics, if you like, called Chaldeans. You might remember that mathematics started with the Sumerian Empire, which comes from this part of the world. And so astronomy, mathematics, languages, chemistry were all part of their training. They were real academics in the truest sense of the word. they were also into the mystical religions. And so Nebuchadnezzar was trained in all those ways. He was a true scholar. He was a trained warrior prince. And in 605 BC, his father, Nabopolassar, died from wounds received in the same battle, but at another place in Palestine there. And in 605 BC, he hightailed it back to Babylon and did what they called take the hands of Bel. He had to do that to become king. Bel Marduk was their god. It was a god who loved gold, by the way, and we'll see that in a moment. Now, dreams and visions were an important part. Now, I said before that, I had myself gone and validated all this. And when I was doing some research, and I did this research nearly 30 years ago, and I came across this. It's a cuneiform tablet that is sitting in the British Museum. It's one of 20,000 that they dug up in Babylon around about 1890, but it wasn't deciphered until 1929 by a man called Robert Calderway. He decided to decipher the cuneiform, and it had the story of Nebuchadnezzar's campaign all the way through Palestine in those days, and it dated Nebuchadnezzar's first siege of Jerusalem in the year 605 BC. There were two others. There was another one in 597 and another one in 586, where the Babylonians actually razed Jerusalem to the ground at that time. And so we've got archaeological evidence that these people existed, that the campaigns happened, and that the dating is true. And we can bring that down to our day to find out what happened in the past to validate what we think will happen in the future. Now, when about 3 years later, in about 602 BC, Nebuchadnezzar, who was now King Nebuchadnezzar II, had an ancient dream. It says in the Bible, in Daniel chapter 2 and verse 1, it says, "Now in the second year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams, and his spirit was so troubled that his sleep left him. And so he called in his wise men." And of course, how many times have you had a dream, woke up, and what happened? You tell me what happens. You forget the dream. That's what happened to him. And so he called in his wise men, and he wanted them to tell him the dream. He said, "I've had a dream that deeply troubles me, and I must know what it means." Well, the story goes that they hummed and hummed for a little while. Now, remember, I said that Nebuchadnezzar was an academic, a very smart man. He was a tactician. He was an administrator. He was a politician. He was a king. He was an academic. He was no dummy. And personally, it's not written down, but I think that these wise men had been pulling his leg on a few occasions. And I think that he probably didn't trust them all that much, because he asked them to tell him the dream, you see. But the astrologers answered the king in Aramaic, which was, by the way, it was the language of diplomacy of those days. When I was in Syria in 1995, we had a Syrian guide. He used to be a captain in the army and the medical corps, and he spoke French. And in that part of the world in 1995, French was still the language of diplomacy. Don't know about today. Things have changed so much. Probably is. But anyway, so the astrologers answered the king in Aramaic, "Long live the king. Tell us the dream and we'll tell you what it means." Well, we're Australians. And if somebody said that to me, what would you be thinking? You'd be thinking, I don't know too much about their genuineness, if I could use that term. And so the king said to the astrologers, "I'm serious about this. If you don't tell me what my dream was and what it means, you will be torn limb from limb, and your houses will be turned into heaps of rubble. But if you tell me what I dream and what the dream means, I will give you many wonderful gifts and honors. Just tell me the dream and what it means." Well, They said again, "Please, your majesty, tell us the dream, and we will tell you what it means." The king replied, "I know what you're doing. You're stalling for time because you know that I'm serious when I say, if you don't tell me the dream, you're doomed. So you have conspired to tell me lies, hoping I will change my mind. But tell me the dream, and then I'll know that you can tell me what it means." And so the astrologers replied to the king, "No one on earth can tell the king his dream." Now, these guys were supposed to be in contact with the gods. They were supposed to have dreams too. And if they had a dream, they would come to the king and tell him whatever the future was for the kingdom at that day. And here they are admitting that no one on earth can tell the king his dream. And no king, however great and powerful, has ever asked such a thing of any magician, enchanter, or astrologer. The king's demand is impossible. No one except the gods can tell you your dream, and they do not live here among the people, but they are supposed to be in contact with the gods. And so you can imagine by this time, Nebuchadnezzar is starting to get a little bit steamed up. The king was furious when he heard this, and he ordered that all the wise men of Babylon be executed. Well, in 605 BC, when Nebuchadnezzar had to go back to Babylon to become king, he took certain of the cream of the crop of Jerusalem, mainly the royal families, and a lot of young people who were smart. And he actually, out of all these young people, he chose 4 people, and he trained them for 3 years, that they would become administrators in his kingdom. But not only did they have to become administrators in the kingdom, they would also have to learn the magic arts of the Babylonians. And so there were 4 of them. There was Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were their names. Nebuchadnezzar actually changed their names to represent his gods. But Daniel had found favor with the king. Matter of fact, when at the end of 3 years, when they did their final exams, they actually stood before King Nebuchadnezzar for an oral exam. And the Bible tells us that Nebuchadnezzar found Daniel so much smarter than everybody else. Matter of fact, the Bible uses a hyperbole. It says 10 times smarter, which is a lot. And in the meantime, Daniel had created a relationship with the king. And Daniel asked the king if he could just have the night to ask his God what the dream was. So Daniel went home and told his friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, what had happened. He urged them to ask the God of heaven to show them his mercy by telling them the secret so they would not be executed along with the other wise men of Babylon. I need to keep up with my notes, don't I? Well, the next morning, after a night of prayer for the 4 of them, the next morning, Daniel went to see the king. The secret was revealed to Daniel in a vision. He went into the king, he said, "Don't kill the wise men." Remember, he's one of the wise men, so they were caught up in it as well. "Take me to the king," he said to Arioch, who was the king's guard at that time. "I will tell him the meaning of his dream." Arioch quickly took Daniel to the king and said, "I've found one of the captives from Judah who will tell the king the meaning of his dream." And so the king said to Daniel, also known as Belteshazzar is a Babylonian god name, "Is this true? Can you tell me what my dream was and what it means?" "There is a God in heaven who reveals secrets, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days." And so, you, O king, were watching, and behold, a great image, that great image whose splendor was excellent, stood before you, and its form was awesome. Its form was awesome. That head of gold represents Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar's empire. And Babylon ruled the world from 605 to 539 BC, and that's documented very well. Gold was a very fitting symbol for Babylon. I think in the temple of Babylon, there was something like 18 tons of gold. And we'll see in a slide in a minute I think 18 tons of gold in today's value is about over $1 trillion. And so he said he was that head of gold. He said, after you will be a chest and arms of silver, which is another kingdom, and after you another kingdom of bronze, and after you another kingdom of iron legs. And right down the bottom you can see those feet of speckled iron and clay. But after that there will be a rock that will come and hit that kingdom and smash it to pieces. And that rock that smashed the statue of to pieces was, of course, the kingdom of God, which grew into a whole mountain, and that represents the second coming of Christ. So we've got Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, Rome. The feet represents the divided nations of Western Europe, and after that, which is the world today, and after that comes the kingdom of Christ. Now, Babylon, being the golden kingdom, like I said, there was something like 18 tons of gold in the temple of Marduk. That's the temple of Marduk right in the middle of this depiction of the ancient city of Babylon. Those gates down on the right, your left down there, they're called the Ishtar gates. They're actually in the British Museum, and you can actually go and see them today. There's another illustration of it. So the gold in Nebuchadnezzar's temple was 1,267,957,000 and a few dollars. That's what was just in that particular temple. And so here's a relief of Nebuchadnezzar and his temple. You can go and see them in the British Museum and in the German Museum. And Daniel said to Nebuchadnezzar, he said, "You are this head of gold." But he said, "After you shall arise another kingdom, inferior to yours. It had a chest and arms of silver, which was the kingdom of the Medes and the Persians." Now, by the way, in 613 BC, the Medes and the Persians, which is up the top of what modern day Iraq in the mountains, and Babylon were actually allies, and they defeated the Assyrian Empire. And here they are fighting against each other now. So things change in the world. That's the silver empire of the Medes and the Persians. That was the currency of the day. The Medes and the Persians overthrew Babylon, and they did it in a very smart way. In 539 BC, Nebuchadnezzar's grandson was having well, you can only call it an orgy. And in that feast that night, they drank out of the temple vessels that they'd stolen from Jerusalem, which was blasphemy in those days. And on the wall, a hand wrote these words, "Mene, mene, tekel upharsin." And this is the interpretation of each word. Mene, God has numbered your kingdom and finished it. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Peres, your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. Thus said the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have held, to subdue nations before him and loose the armor of kings, to open before him the double doors so that the gates will not be shut. 150 years before Cyrus invaded Babylon, the prophet Isaiah wrote these words, and they told these words to Cyrus, and whether Cyrus ever became a follower of the God of the day, Yahweh, we don't know. But God had foretold this 150 years before, and he told Cyrus exactly how he would invade Babylon. The Euphrates River ran right through the center of the town, and what they did is they diverted the river around the city, and the gates that were across the water had been left open, and soldiers just marched straight in. And so it was quite an easy chore. This is Cyrus's cylinder. Again, this is in the British Museum, and this you can read the whole story on this. It's if you just Google Cyrus's cylinder, there's translations there of the whole battle. Now you may not know this, but Saddam Hussein considered himself the reincarnation of Nebuchadnezzar II, and Saddam Hussein was actually starting to rebuild the ancient city of Babylon, which God said would never be rebuilt. That's the palace that Saddam built. And you can see there's a hill there. There used to be a village there, and it used to be flat. And he got rid of the village, built that mound, and built himself a palace on the top so that he could look over the new city of Babylon that he was building. But the Bible said in Jeremiah, Babylon shall become a heap, a dwelling place for jackals, an astonishment and a hissing, without an inhabitant. And there is no one who inhabits that today. Even when during the Gulf Wars, the Americans didn't even inhabit it. They camped just nearby, but they never went into the ruins themselves. Babylon, the glory of kingdoms, will be as when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. Wild beasts of the desert will lie there, and their houses will be full of owls, and ostriches will dwell there. And you can see the birds on top of that pillar there. So you can go over there and see it today. How the Bible foretold these things 2,500 years ago, and we can look at them today, and so we can trust the Bible. Babylon shall sink and not rise from catastrophe that I will bring upon her. And really, modern day Iraq is still in a lot of trouble. There's still a lot of unrest there. It's a very rich country. Professor William Foxwell Albright was considered one of the greatest archaeologists of all time. He wrote something like 800 books, and just on archaeology. He was director of the American School of Oriental Research. That means that he did the Middle East area. He said this about the Bible. He said, in the center of history stands the Bible. Thanks to modern research, we can now recognize its substantial historicity. To sum up, we can now treat the Bible from beginning to end as an authentic document of religious history. Remember, the Bible only talks about God's interaction with men from a religious point of view. And so, after the Medes and the Persians, the Bible says there will be another kingdom, a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over all the earth. I had the privilege of doing some further study at the University of New England down there at Armidale, and I read on ancient Greek empire from 400 BC down to Christ's day, and I came across this guy called Alexander the Great, and he was the guy who actually defeated the Medes and the Persians. Now, Alexander the Great also went down to Egypt. When he came down to Egypt, the Egyptians actually showed him some of the Bible texts and told him that he was their coming pharaoh. And so when Alexander the Great went to Egypt, he never really damaged a lot. They just accepted him. And you can see that on some of the reliefs down at Thebes, on these big walls that they've uncovered with all these hieroglyphics on it. Alexander himself lived in Babylon, and that's where he died, by the way. Only reigned for 11 years. He died, by the look of it, of alcoholic poisoning. But he was such a brilliant tactician and a good student. Alexander the Great. Finally, the Bible says there will be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron. And that's what the legs of the statue represent. And so there's a man called Edward Gibbon who wrote The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, and he categorized and dated the four empires from history. He said Babylon came to power in 605, and it was gold. Medo-Persia came to power in 539. It was an empire of silver. Greece, 331 BC, an empire of bronze. And of course, we know pagan Rome come to power in 168 BC, and that was the kingdom of iron. And so, with all these kingdoms, it says down the bottom, and this is the strange part, and this is where we are today, you and I, that iron mixed with clay. It says, whereas you saw the feet and toes partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, the kingdom shall be divided. So the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly fragile. I had the opportunity when I was I think I was about 15, and I worked in a foundry in Sydney. This is when foundries existed. And one of my jobs was to build the sand things for the castings, for the tradesmen to go and pour their ore in. And when I was learning to do that, of course, sometimes I didn't really pack the sand very well. And it sort of, when the ore was poured in, it sort of mixed in with the sand. And when we, the next day, when we broke the castings, of course, it didn't come out like the tradesmen wanted them to come out. So I didn't last in that job very long. I think because I wasn't much of a moulder, but you can see that God really does know his stuff when he talks about miry clay mixed with iron. It doesn't stay together. It is very fragile. The feet of iron and clay represented the divided Roman Empire, which ultimately became divided Europe. As you saw iron mixed with ceramic clay, they will mingle with the seed of men, but they will not adhere to one another, just as iron does not mix with clay. You might remember the French general Napoleon talking about Europe. He said there will be one Europe, there will be one currency, there will be one language, there will be one government over all of Europe. Well, that didn't really happen, did it? Matter of fact, when you look at the British Empire, there was one stage there, especially around the 1900s, at the turn of the century there, where just about all the crown heads of Europe were related to this lady, Queen Victoria. They had all intermarried. And of course, as you know from your history of the First World War, that was what they called that one big family fight. So Europe really hasn't stuck together very well. And as the Bible says, as you saw iron mixed with clay, so they will mix with one another in marriage, but they will not hold together, just as iron does not mix with clay. You know, a few years ago, we heard of a thing called the common market. Do you remember that? The European Union. And there was something like, if you go back on Google, you can Google these. You can Google every Time magazine cover. Oh, I don't know, must be from about the 60s, and there's a lot of them. And it sort of made fun of the common market, of the first one on the left here. You can't see it quite, but it says how Britain went bonkers, and that was over Brexit. Then it says, my God, what have we done? Talking about atomic explosions and things like that. You know, the world is just as divided now as it ever was. And the idea of Europe becoming united is just not going to happen. Daniel continues. He said, you watched while a stone was cut out without hands, which struck the image on its feet of iron and clay and broke them into pieces. This is an animation that a friend of mine sent me last night. I think she's done a great job showing this. How true that is. It goes on to say, and the kingdom shall not be left to another people. In other words, human civilization will cease. It shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. The great God has made known to the king, this was King Nebuchadnezzar, what will come to pass after this. He says, the dream is certain and its interpretation is sure. And so the thing that we're waiting for now is the second coming of Christ. And we're going to talk about that a lot tomorrow night, about the signs of the second coming. But Daniel in 2:44 says, and in the days of these kings, that's the divided nations really of the world, days of these kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. And the world's last empire will soon appear. It's interesting that John the Revelator, the last book of the Bible, said this. He says, the kingdoms of this world have become the kingdoms of our Lord and of his Christ, and he shall reign forever. And so, we started the program by asking the question, is there any hope? You know, it's interesting if you can see one of these. We saw a few of these in my day. Everyone who predicted the end of the world had one thing in common. They were wrong. But there is hope because God knows and reveals the future, and God is in control. And so there is hope. So tomorrow night we're going to look at the signs of the second coming. What does it mean? Is there any meaning in what's going on in the world today? Any meaning in ecology, in politics, in violence, in just life in general? 2,000 years ago, Jesus sat on some rocks, and his disciples came up to him, and they asked him. They said to him, "Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the world?" And tomorrow night, we're going to have a look at that exactly. And so, we are on the knife edge of eternity. Is there any hope? Yes, there is. And as we go through this program, I hope to instill some of that hope into you. Thanks for listening tonight. You know what I'd like to do? I'd like to have a little prayer for you. I got to tell you a story first. I was in my garage. I was a mechanic at the time. I had a mechanical business. And a man came in with his broken down, and I'll mention it was a Volvo. I didn't like working on Volvos, but and I opened the bonnet, and his throttle, it was a carbureted car, and his throttle was held up with a bit of wire, and the wire had jammed up. And he looked like a nice bloke, looked like a bit of a battler, and took me about 5 minutes to fix it. And he said, "Oh, how much do I owe you?" I said, "Look, mate, don't worry about it, it's fine." And so I just walked back into the, because I had a car up on the hoist. I walked out, and he followed me in. And he said, "You sure you don't want any money?" I said, "No, I don't want any money, it's fine." I'd never seen him before, didn't think I'd see him again. And anyway, he said, "What's your name?" I said, "David." And he said, "Well, my name's Sonny." He said, "And I'm a Christian book salesman." He said, "If you won't take any money, I'm going to have a prayer for you." And with that, didn't even ask, he just dropped his head and he started praying for me. And I looked at him and I thought, and this is my exact thought, honestly, I thought, who is this person? He's a nut. That's 40 years ago, and that man is still one of my favourite best friends. We do a lot of flying together. And so I thought, well, I'll have a prayer for you too. So I'm going to have a prayer for you. Our Father in heaven, for those that are both on screens and those that are here physically tonight, I just want to ask you, Lord, that you would impress their minds that there is hope for their future and the future of their families. I do pray, dear Lord, that each one listening, both here and online, would take the opportunity to think about their position in the world, where we are in this world. You know, years ago, things would happen and things would get better. That's not happening anymore. Things just seem to go from worse to worse, and there's no hope on the horizon. And we'll look at more of that tomorrow night. But dear Lord, I pray that you would bless everybody here tonight, give them safe travelling mercies and a good night's sleep, because we ask in the wonderful name of Jesus.